All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. It is great to see you all today, and we are recording the session. I have definitely over planned and included a lot of slides today. I know that we won't be able to get into the level of detail that I would hope, but you'll have access to this presentation and this recording, obviously, after the conference. So first of all, thank you all so much for joining me for this session. My name is Katherine Kelbaugh, and I am the Executive Director of the National Association of Museum Schools, and also the Executive Director of the Museum School of Avondale Estates, which is a museum school in the Atlanta area. And so we have a couple of different kind of buckets for today's presentation. First of all, I want to introduce you to museum schools. If this is the first time that you are hearing about this innovative and unique model and style of learning, I will talk a little bit about the National Association of Museum Schools. And then I want you all to think about application. So I want you to think about, as we discuss the museum model of learning and the style of learning, how this can be applied not only to your situations and your settings, but also thinking about this conference and thinking about some of the application that you'll be doing in the next couple of days. How can this museum model of learning be expanded and applied outside of even the current settings? So again, I'm Katherine Kelbaugh, and I'm very glad to be with you all today. And again, for our agenda, we'll be talking about just museum schools and what this museum type of learning looks like. And then we'll have some discussion around expanding the museum model. And then we'll do a couple of closing activities together. So feel free to use the chat for questions. We also have some folks that are just introducing themselves. Thank you so much for that, letting us know where you are and what organization or what group you represent. And again, feel free to use the chat for questions throughout the presentation. I'll be checking on that and be glad to answer those questions again throughout the presentation and then also at the end. All right, so we're going to start by talking a little bit about this museum school model. But first, let's take a look at the museum schools themselves. So there are about 50 museum schools across the country, and there's not one universal definition at this point or one stamp that defines a specific museum school. Essentially, museum schools are those schools that are formally partnering with museums to get kids out of this traditional classroom and really engaged in true, just hands-on real world learning. And again, they do this with formal partnerships with museums and zoos, aquariums, history centers, science centers, really all of these community resources and these institutions that can offer students a chance to really immerse themselves in their learning. So when it comes to these museum schools, again, there are about 50 right now across the country. They serve a variety of students. So some are K-12, some are K-5, some are K-8. There are some that are high school only. Some are preschool only. So really, the museum schools are serving a wide range of grade levels. In addition, these museum schools are found throughout a variety of communities. So they're found in rural settings and urban settings, as well as suburban settings. The museum schools are also found within a variety of school structures. So there are a few museum schools that are private schools. The majority private schools, the majority of them are public schools. And then really within that public school bucket, there are a couple of different paths as well. So some of the museum schools are charter schools. Charter schools are public schools. They just have additional autonomy in exchange for increased accountability. And then there are museum schools that are that are magnet and theme schools. So these are also public schools that are really, their enrollment is application based. So they have a specific theme that they focus on, and then families within the community can apply to these schools. And then there are also museum schools that are just traditional public schools, and their districts and other community members have come together and instituted this type of learning. The other fascinating thing about our museum schools across the country is that they really are serving a very diverse group of students. So not only are they found in different communities and within different school structures, but additionally, they really are serving a wide variety of students. So when it comes to free and reduced lunch, for instance, some museum schools have less than 10% free and reduced lunch. Others have over 90%. We see, kind of a similar range when it comes to students of color, as well as students with disabilities, students that are English language learners. So these museum schools are not found just in one type of learning environment. We're finding that these museum schools are across the country, and they really are serving a diverse group of students successfully. All right, so here is a quick look when we think about where these museum schools are located. The blue states signify there being at least one museum school in that state. Most of the states that are highlighted here do only have one or two museum schools. The states that have more than one museum school are California, Florida, North Carolina, and New York. But most of the other states only have one museum school. And again, the idea of the museum school is this formal partnership with museums to really enhance student learning. So not to take the place of what's happening in the classroom, but instead to make sure that students have an enhanced opportunity for their learning. And because the majority of these museum schools are public schools, they are required to follow these state standards, and they're required to take the state standardized test. So, really the museum schools are looking for innovative and unique ways to teach these standards and go beyond. And that's exactly what they're doing. So shifting a little bit to the association, and then we're going to dive into exactly what this museum model means, and what does it mean to have a museum type setting in terms of students learning and teachers teaching. But this definition has been proposed by the National Association of Museum Schools as it relates to these individual museum schools. But essentially, museum schools strengthen traditional education by positioning rich resources and learning experiences that are provided by cultural institutions at the core of their curriculum. So through collaborations, museum school students engage in hands-on object-based learning that results in students exhibiting their knowledge. And we're going to dive into this so you know exactly what this looks like in these different museum schools. But essentially, museum schools, they value cultural institutions, foster formal and informal education partnerships, curate object-centered experiences, employ museum learning principles, and then cultivate a love of lifelong learning. Now, I'm going to go past these next couple of slides very quickly, but you'll have access to these. Really, the National Association of Museum Schools was formed initially by me and some other staff members at the Museum School of Avondale Estates back in 2014. Under a grant, and then the grant money ran out, and the association kind of sat dormant for a few years, and then we picked it back up just to try to bring together not only current museum schools, but figure out pathways to build new museum schools, and then also bringing museums in the fold to increase their K-12 programming, whether they're working with museum schools or non-museum schools. So that's just a little bit of history into the association. But essentially, the overall mission and goals of the association is really just to expand this model. We obviously want to advance our current museum schools. We also want to accelerate museum programming. So this is thinking about working directly with museums. So again, whether they're working with museum schools or non-museum schools, for them to be able to increase their impact and outcomes as they're working with K-12 students. And then, of course, the association is definitely very interested in advocating for additional museum schools. And you'll see there a few of the values of the association. So really looking at some core elements of museum learning. So what is it about these museum schools that is replicable, that we can expand to other schools? How can we continue to embrace the power of museums and schools coming together? And really thinking about the members of the association. How can we enhance our current museum schools and increase access, which we know would benefit students, teachers, and museum educators. So let's dive more into the specifics of museum schools. So the way I'm going to present this is like in all museum schools do this, most museum schools do this, and some museum schools do this, just so you can get a feel for what these schools actually look like on a kind of operational basis. So let's start with the all. All museum schools partner with museums, zoos, aquariums, and other organizations to enhance classroom learning and lessons. And these are formal partnerships. So this is different than a traditional school going to the zoo once a year for an end of the year field trip and spending 6 or 7 hours at the zoo and then hopping back on the bus and checking it off. Through these partnerships, through these formal partnerships, most museum schools and most museum school students are actually traveling outside of their classroom, and they're traveling about every other week or every 3 weeks or so. The way they're able to travel out so often is because these the trips are very focused and structured. So as opposed to the traditional end of year trip going to the zoo and spending 7 hours there, when museum school students are visiting their partners, they are focused specifically on the exhibits that align with what they're learning in the classroom. So truly the museum becomes an extension of the classroom and the learning that's taking place there. In addition to these expeditions, field trips, they're called different things by the different museum schools. There also is a very heavy component when it comes to the student. So essentially, hands-on exhibits and interactions with the masters in the field give the students the opportunity to really engage with the concepts and standards. So as the students are traveling on these learning expeditions, they're engaging with the exhibits in a more meaningful way, they're interacting with the docents in an extremely interactive way. And then as you'll see in a second, most museum school students then are creating their own projects to describe and to detail what they've learned through those experiences. So essentially creating their own museum once they return back to the school. So again, before we leave this slide, we know that all museums have these formal partnerships, all these museum schools have these formal partnerships with these different organizations. And through their interactions with the museum staff and the exhibits, that is what is extending their classroom learning. Now, when you'll have access to this presentation, you'll be able to click on some links and see some videos. I know that we're a little tight on time today, but just to give you an idea of what most museum schools do. So most museum schools have some sort of exhibit night, exhibition night, showcase night. So after they've visited these museum sites and they've created these amazing projects that demonstrate what they've learned, then they become their own curators and schools become museums. And this, again, typically happens either once a quarter or even once a semester, depending on the museum school and their own calendar. But this takes it to the next step and allows students to, again, create their own projects and then to exhibit and display those. When the school becomes a museum during these exhibit nights, obviously parents and family members are invited in, but the community is invited in. And essentially now the student becomes the master of this content and is acting as a docent and a curator for their own exhibits. We've talked a little bit already about the expeditions. So most museum schools are doing formal expeditions. Our museum school, the Museum School of Avondale Estates, calls them learning expeditions. We've intentionally not used the word field trip because field trip, again, a lot of times implies something that is less education-based and kind of more fun-based. And while obviously our expeditions we think are very fun, we also want to acknowledge that they have such a stronger educational component. And we want to make sure that the term learning expeditions definitely reflects that. Another piece that most museum schools are doing is some sort of travel journal. So at the beginning of whether it's a 9-week unit or an 18-week unit, the students actually start with a blank book and really kind of create their own textbook throughout their study. So this blank book becomes the house for their wonderings and questions before and after expeditions. They house the graphic organizers that help them understand and explain these concepts, understand the concepts themselves, and then be able to explain them to others later. They house questions and, again, wonderings for future expeditions, their reflections of their current expeditions and projects. And so really by the time the unit finishes, the students have essentially a textbook / diary that really outlines their learning throughout the dedicated unit. And then finally, most museum schools are doing some sort of project-based learning. And obviously the project-based learning is the idea of developing and creating projects that demonstrate students' understanding of concepts and skills. Some museum schools are actually doing problem-based learning as well. And so essentially they're looking at solving problems within the community, working through expeditions with their museum partners to help solve some problems. And then obviously those projects are displayed as part of exhibit nights. The other piece that I'll tell you, and I would be glad to have any other conversations after this presentation and dive more into data, but I will tell you that as we're looking at museum schools and their outcomes, so compared to non-museum school students, based on state standardized test, which at this point is the kind of easiest, most universal way to really compare these schools, most museum schools are outperforming their non-museum school peers, both at the local level, so within their district, but also at the state level. So we know with this model, students are more engaged in their learning, and we know based on some of these traditional accountability measures that they're working as well. So we need to figure out how to get this model in front of more students. So let's shift to the sum. So we talked about all museum schools do this. Most museum school does this. And now let's talk a little bit about the sum piece. So what I want you to think about here is the different structures of some of these museum schools. So some museum schools are actually housed on museum campuses. So the museum itself hosts its own museum school, or the museum itself has partnered with this school and they're hosted on the campus. But literally the museum school students are able to walk over on a daily basis, walk over into the exhibits and interact with the museum that's right there on their campus. Now, some museum schools are housed on separate campuses and they visit museums. So the majority of museum schools are in this category. So they are housed, whether it's in a traditional school building or another facility, and then they visit the museums. What's interesting is that these museum schools have been opened and led by a variety of groups. So you'll see some examples here. So some are charter schools that have been started from scratch by community members. In other cases, there are school districts that have either converted their current traditional public schools or have open museum schools that are focused again on this museum model of learning. In some cases, museums have opened their own preschools and opened their own K-5 and even higher grade level museum schools. And then there are numerous examples of a combination of these groups. So essentially it's a group of community organizations, so a school district and a museum and maybe a local business that is coming together and creating these museum schools. So as you can see, where there are some core similarities in terms of what this type of learning looks like. The actual museum schools themselves definitely look different throughout the country. So I want to make sure that we have some time for you all to think about applying some of these concepts. I'm going to go through these next few slides fairly quickly. And I do want you all to start thinking about the application piece here. And, I know that the really the theme and push and challenge of this camp is thinking bigger and broader than just right now, thinking 2030. So thinking about the 2030 goals, also thinking about, creating a utopian education society and system. So when we think about museum model, I think the three things that I would have you really consider here is the hands-on learning piece, the documenting of that learning, and then the showcasing of that learning. So the actual learning itself, how is it documented, and then how is that showcased and shared with others? All right, so as we think about the actual learning piece, so I want you to again consider the museum school model in a traditional school setting. This hands-on learning piece can come through different ways. So there's inquiry-based learning where students are engaged, they're asking higher order questions, they're being asked higher order questions, and their learning goes beyond just that very basic knowledge level of learning. Another key to the hands-on learning piece of the museum model is the learning expeditions. And so that's getting out into the community. We talked about some of those formal relationships and partnerships, but that also is informal as well. So community resource centers like the post office and farmers markets and city halls and courthouse. I'll give you a few examples from our museum school. As our first graders are studying goods and services and producers and consumers, they take $3 to the local farmers market and they get to interact with the producers as consumers and get to have that experience. They come back and then eventually at the end of the unit, they create their own business where they offer a good or service. And so as part of exhibit night, community members come in and they interact with these first graders who have created their own business, obviously taking the lessons that they've learned from their other experiences with consumers and producers throughout the community. In addition to that, as our third graders were studying human resources, natural resources, capital resources. I don't know if we have any Waffle House fans out there, but Waffle House started here in the Avondale Estates, Decatur area where our school is. And so our third graders go to Waffle House and learn about human resources, natural resources, and capital resources, and then come back and prepare to present that knowledge and learning to the community. So again, I would stress that museum schools are extremely innovative and creative, and not only taking advantage of these formal partnerships, but also these informal partnerships as well. The other thing that we've really learned through the pandemic is the importance not only of getting out, but also staying in. Through the pandemic, especially with the museum school, we've had to be very creative with exactly how we're going to continue this hands-on learning. So we have really increased our virtual expeditions. We've increased our guest speakers. And these guest speakers definitely, sometimes they fall in the mold of that traditional, lecture kind of based speaking, but we also have really gained so much, and our students have gained so much from storytellers and other, experts that are able to come in and, even simulate different events and simulate different historical figures. And then service learning as well as social justice standards are also, both very, very high priorities for museum schools as well. I'm going to go past this one pretty quickly. We've talked quite a bit about the documenting of the learning within the museum school model. So that's through travel journals and projects. Again, once you have access to this presentation, you'll be able to click here on some of these links, and it will take you to some examples of these travel journals and projects. And then we've also talked about the showcase piece of the museum model. So it's the learning it, the documenting, and then showcasing it. So not only really providing students opportunities to exhibit their work within the school building, but also thinking about how this work can be displayed within the community and how this impact can go beyond just the actual museum school students. So if we think about expanding the museum model, there are lots of ways that we can do this. And again, I urge you to think about within your own setting, how can even one or two of these concepts maybe be implemented to really increase the engagement of your students, as well as the motivation of your students and your teachers. So the way that the association is thinking about expanding, one is through replicating or expanding current museum schools. Another is creating new museum schools. We also are thinking about expansion by simply enhancing our K-12 museum programming. And then finally, increasing museum model practices in classrooms in schools. So this may be for, the educator that comes to a NAMS, a National Association of Museum Schools conference, may not have the decision making to decide that the whole school is going to be a museum school or even the whole grade level. But what are some of these high quality, research-based, proven practices that could be put in place in any classroom, whether you were a formal museum school or not? So as we think about this, and I'll pause in just a second, because I'm going to go past a couple of these slides pretty quickly, because the way that you would think about museum model practices is essentially to, as a classroom teacher, you would break down, okay, what is our learning target, our key takeaways, our essential questions, depending on how this is framed within your school. So essentially, what do you want students to know? And then how are we going to get there? So what are the hands-on materials? Who are the people that would enhance this learning experience? And what are the experiences themselves that would enhance the learning experience? Another question that we would push, teachers that are thinking of this museum model type of learning, we would also push them to think about connections with other subjects. One of the things that several museum schools do is they very intentionally partner their general ed classroom teachers with their specialty teachers. So their art, music, PE, Spanish, technology, science, these different exploratory specials for them to really develop very, very intentional lessons that help to extend what you would consider general ed topics and standards to these situations and settings outside of just the core classroom. So again, PE, art, music. So again, as we're thinking about from the perspective of how do we get these museum model practices into classrooms, after you kind of dive through the standard itself, then you would want to start thinking about how the students will document their learning, how they'll show their mastery, how that will be displayed. And then, obviously just good teaching is, how do I know if my students mastered this? Like, can I use any of these pieces to determine how my students mastered this content? And so I'm going to talk about this slide, and then we'll pause for a minute. I'd be glad to answer any questions. And then I would love for our last bit of time together for us to be thinking about your takeaways. But when we think about expanding the museum model, and when you think about your role in the Space Camp this week, and thinking bigger and broader than just even your current setting, we can do that, right? We can think big and broad. So what would be the big structures and systems that we would need in place to support museum learning? Or y'all, we can get right into the tree itself. Like, what are the experiences that we can develop on a classroom-based scale to ensure that students have access to this type of learning and to this successful approach? So before we kind of move into an application piece, I will pause, and I'd be glad to answer any questions you have. You're welcome to throw them in the chat, or I have no concerns at all if you want to come off mute and just ask the question yourself, or if there's anything that you would like clarification on, or anything that you would like to share. If you have knowledge of a museum school, or if you've had some experience with this type of learning. So I see a question about museum schools in Northern California. Not that we know of. And, you know, again, the association right now, and obviously constantly, is updating the database, and, you know, making sure that we've represented all of our, all the museum schools that are across the country, that we've represented them within the database. We are not aware of any, but we are continuing to search out. If you do know of any that, you know, we don't have on our database, definitely let us know so that we can get that updated. Okay, so another question, has this been implemented in any community college yet? That's a great question, and not that I am aware of. You know, really the connection between museum schools and colleges and universities really at this point is more of a from what we've seen, more of a kind of a research-based connection. So essentially, you know, starting conversations to get, you know, research support from these research-based universities to really dive into the model itself and you know, identify these core elements and the scalable pieces. But I am not aware of any formal community college implementation of the museum model. Now, I will say that there are definitely, obviously, colleges and universities that have museum studies programs. And I know that they are, of course, very interested in K-12 and museum programming. So I think it's there, but it really hasn't been formally explored. All right. So another question, do learners engage in critically questioning and analyzing museum exhibits? And that's a great question. You know, obviously I'll answer this very broadly because each museum school is a little bit different. And my initial answer to this is yes. And I think one of the primary things that leads to this this closer analysis is just the frequency of visits to museums. So they are visiting museums so often that they're able to think about and connect their previous experiences, whether it was in a different grade level or even earlier that school year or later that school year, a particular exhibit they saw. One of the most consistent pieces of feedback that we get from our museum school, our museum partners, is your kids ask really good questions. And we 100% attribute that just to, you know, this inquiry-based learning, to getting them out into the field, to getting them exposed to experts in the field, to not only be asked higher order questions, but as we mentioned earlier, you know, to be asking higher order questions. So it's something I think that museum schools could be more strategic about. We do know that it's happening informally. I would also say that museum schools are trying to do a better job of their own kind of in-house analysis of exhibits. So if you think about state standards, so for example, you know, science standards with, let's just say, stars, at least in Georgia, our kindergartners touch on stars a little bit, and then there's a little bit more earth science in second grade, a little bit more in fourth grade, and then they really hit it heavy again in sixth grade. So as a K-8 school, we need to do a better job of really connecting those students and letting those sixth graders serve as teachers and mentors to those little ones, letting the little ones really take advantage of those exhibits that are at the school and right there for them to learn from. I think we get so caught up in just the day-to-day that we forget all of the resources that we have right under our noses. But that's a great question. And while I would say that informally has started, we absolutely could dive further into that and really really help to increase the critical thinking and creative thinking that would come from that through our students. All right. So Dot, thank you so much for sharing that about the Tech Interactive. I will definitely check that out. I appreciate you sharing that. Okay, and another question, how teachers at museum schools are trained to implement this type of learning. Does this differ from typical teacher preparation programming? And yes, that's a fantastic question. Obviously, as we are hiring and looking to bring new teachers on board, there really aren't many out there that have a lot of experience or any experience in museum schools per se. So essentially what we look for are some of these are kind of more broader skills. So essentially like wanting to be innovative, wanting to be creative, being resourceful, thinking outside of the box, really feeling comfortable with a student-centered approach to teaching. That's a big one. We look at the standards as kind of a very basic level. And then once students have mastered those, we really use their interest to figure out where we finish the unit. So as opposed to teachers that have had, let's say the formal like Buck Institute PBL training, or like a formal, responsive classroom, or a formal Eureka math, we really are looking for teachers that possess more of these, again, qualities of innovation, creativity, flexibility, wanting to think outside of the box. And, in terms of how the preparation looks different, it coincides. So we have to make sure that obviously our teachers are prepared and ready to teach the core subject areas and teach, science of reading, and making sure that, the core curriculum for math, that they have a good understanding of, and they're prepared to teach and teach well those skills. But when it comes to museum model in particular, it really is, a lot of it is definitely just exposure to the model, and really this different type of thinking, while still making sure that accountability and overall student accountability is at the core. So that, because again, most of these museum schools are public schools, they still are held to these levels of accountability, which is really great for museum schools, because it doesn't seem like it's so far reaching that it would only work with a private school that didn't have any state standards or other accountability. So, Bailey, long answer to your question. There, obviously is definitely a lot of overlap with kind of your traditional teacher programming, but we do add a lot of what we would consider very specific museum school training around just expectations. And hopefully I'll show you in just a minute a QR code to actually join the National Association of Museum Schools. And once you do that, you'll have access to a variety of lesson plans, as well as really different documents and templates that will help you kind of get a feel for what this model looks like. All right. Laura, thank you so much for sharing that information. That absolutely is a missing piece in terms of the really critically assessing exhibits and displays, and I really think that our students could really learn from that. All right, and then from a practical standpoint, how do the more rural museum schools handle the logistics and cost of transportation and connectivity? And that's a great question. And we've had, just our museum school in particular, we've been very lucky to host visitors from around the country. And obviously they're coming from different communities. And we're lucky at our school because we're 10 minutes from downtown Atlanta. So High Museum and Fern Bank and Alliance Theater and Michael Z. Carlos Museum, all of these very outstanding museums are right around the corner. But as we host schools that don't have that same luxury, we talk about, and this goes back to the kind of informal partnerships, outside of the High and Zoo Atlanta and Georgia Aquarium, if students are learning about community members, if students are learning about taxes, if students are learning about government, what are the local resources that even outside of these formal institutions, like what resources could help support that learning, or what people could support that learning? One of the ways that some of the rural schools, because of transportation, they do take advantage of those kind of local resources. And again, now that the pandemic opened up the opportunity for virtual expeditions, I know that a lot of schools are taking advantage of that as well. I will say that with this approach, so we depend on our partners really to teach social studies and science. So we don't have textbooks for social studies and science. We rely on primary sources, secondary sources, and really our partners. And when you eliminate from the budget replacing these textbook series every 2 or 3 years, that really frees up a lot of your funding. So essentially, by starting with our mission of museum model type of learning and then developing a budget around that, it really has opened up some other gaps and areas. For example, the textbooks that then allows us to use those monies on transportation. I know other schools have definitely taken advantage of grants, especially that are available for Title I schools and field trips in particular. So I know that those have been very helpful as well. But it's a great question, and it really is about by focusing on this model and not having, for example, a formal textbook series in science and social studies, that does free up some of your budget to be able to, again, prioritize your expeditions, your exhibit nights, and these partnerships. And Laura, that would be great, an overview and sample lesson plan. I'm actually going to pop my email address up here in just a second. So I know that we are about out of time. I would love for you all to just be thinking about, I don't think we're going to have time to share out, but thinking about the Education 2030 and specifically the goal 4, thinking about how this model, again, whether it's top of the pyramid starting a museum school, or even just integrating these practices into a classroom, like how can that be done? Like, how could you influence that in your current position? And then again, I know later this week, you're going to be asked to think about something much bigger than just the earth, and how, if we were able to develop this an education system from scratch, what is something that you would how would you build that? And I urge you to think about this presentation today and this type of model, and what is something from this session that could be applied to that plan. These things, when you hear about them and you hear about students displaying their work and students going on these learning expeditions, I mean, these aren't, this isn't groundbreaking stuff, but it's intentional and it's strategic, and everyone is bought in. And that's the parents and the students and the staff. And so when you put all those things together, that's when you get this idea of this museum model. And again, we know it works. And we're actually in the process now of formally partnering with some universities to get us even more concrete data. But we do know even on a very surface level that this is working. So our goal is to, whether it's just one teacher at a time or schools at a time, to really think about how we can get this unique model in the hands of other students and other teachers. So there are a couple of things on this screen. First of all, my email address. I'd love to stay in touch and continue to have conversations and think about how, if there's a way that the National Association of Museum Schools or the Museum School of Avondale Estates could support you and your work. I'd love to talk about that. There's a QR code here. If you just scan that, it will take you to our NAMS website, where you'll have access to different resources, not only lesson plans, but also, there are examples of preparing your docents for exhibit night. And there are unit plans that map out very similar to that organizer a few minutes ago. So this is what we want students to learn. How are we going to get there? And it helps you kind of visualize the museum model laid out a little bit better. And then also by joining NAMS, you'll be on our mailing list. We're in the process of preparing for a second conference. We had our first one a couple years ago. So we're looking at another conference here in Atlanta where we'd be bringing folks together and again, thinking about this model and how we can continue to advance it. So I think that I have gone over a couple of minutes. I'm so sorry that your application time was cut short. But if you do have any other questions, I would be glad to answer those. Definitely appreciate your time and your participation today, and would absolutely love to stay in touch with all of you.